At 04:17 on the morning of February 9th, 1943, Joseph Rawlins stood in the cramped galley of the USS Benson, watching coffee boil over on a stove he should have been attending. But his attention was fixed on a sound no one else on the destroyer seemed to hear. The ship rolled hard to starboard through North Atlantic swells that made every loose piece of equipment in the galley rattle and sing. But beneath that chaos was something else. A metallic ping that didn't belong. A frequency that made the mechanics part of his brain light up like a warning lamp, even though he'd been cooking eggs for sailors for 8 months straight. The Benson was running escort for convoy HX-224, 53 merchant ships hauling fuel, ammunition, and food across 2,800 miles of ocean, the German U-boats treated like a private hunting ground. In January alone, the Kriegsmarine had sunk 47 Allied ships in the North Atlantic. February was shaping up worse. The convoy had left New York 5 days earlier, with 7 destroyers and 2 corvettes as protection. By dawn on the 9th, 2 of those destroyers had limped back to port with mechanical failures, and the remaining escorts were stretched so thin across the formation that massive gaps existed where a submarine could slip through and sink 3 transports before anyone noticed. Rawlins wasn't supposed to care about any of that. He was ship's cook second class, a rate the Navy handed to men who couldn't shoot straight, couldn't navigate, and couldn't fix engines, but could keep 400 sailors fed on powdered eggs and canned meat. The training manual for his job ran exactly 16 pages and mentioned nothing about submarines, depth charges, or the particular metallic resonance that a faulty pressure seal makes when it's about to kill everyone aboard. But Rawlins had spent 6 years before the war working night shifts at the Ford River Rouge plant in Detroit, where every machine had its own voice, and you learned to hear the difference between normal operation and catastrophic failure 3 seconds before the foreman did. He joined the Navy in December 1941 because the recruiting office in Detroit had a line out the door, and the only rate available that week was cook. Rawlins didn't know how to cook. He knew how to tear down a V8 engine block, lap valves and gap spark plugs in his sleep. But the recruiter said the Navy had enough mechanics and not enough cooks. So Rawlins learned to crack eggs with one hand and flip pancakes with the other, while his real skills went to waste in a galley that smelled like burnt oil and dish soap. The sound came again. Ping! Metallic, sharp, wrong. It was coming from somewhere aft, down past the galley, through 2 watertight doors and a passageway that led to the depth charge racks. Rawlins wiped his hands on a towel that had been grey since November and pushed through the galley hatch into the dim corridor beyond. The ship heaved. He grabbed a pipe to steady himself. Cold seawater dripped from rivets overhead. The Benson was 19 years old, a relic from the last war pressed back into service because newer destroyers couldn't be built fast enough to replace the ones being sunk. He made his way aft, past crew bunks where exhausted men slept through the rolling chaos, past the damage control locker with its axes and fire hoses, past the hatch to the engine room where boilers screamed and the air tasted like steam. At the stern, he climbed a ladder to the open deck where the depth charge racks sat like mechanical altars to controlled violence. Each rack held 6 depth charges, steel drums packed with 300 pounds of Torpex explosive designed to sink submarines by crushing their hulls with pressure waves that could crack ribs at 100 yards. The sea was black under a sky without stars. The convoy stretched out ahead, dark shapes against darker water, each transport trailing a white wake that looked like chalk dust on slate. Somewhere beneath those wakes, German submarines tracked the convoy with hydrophones, waiting for the escorts to make a mistake, to drift too far from the formation, to leave a gap. When that gap appeared, a U-boat would surface just long enough to fire 4 torpedoes, then dive before the destroyers could respond. By the time the escort arrived, the submarine would be 2 miles away, at 200 feet depth, untouchable. Rawlins reached the depth charge racks and immediately saw the problem. The charges were standard Mark 7 models, each one fitted with a Mark 17 hydrostatic pistol, a pressure-activated fuse that detonated the charge at a preset depth. The pistol assembly sat on top of each drum like a steel mushroom, and between the pistol body and the charge casing was a copper gasket designed to seal the pressure chamber. That gasket was supposed to be 0.8 millimeters thick. The one Rawlins was looking at was 0.5 millimeters, thin enough that he could see light through the edge when he held it up to the dim battle lantern. He pulled another charge from the rack. Same gasket, too thin. He checked 4 more, all of them wrong. Someone at the factory, probably some procurement officer in Washington trying to save 12 cents per unit, had approved a thinner gasket because the paperwork said 0.5 millimeters was within acceptable tolerance. But acceptable tolerance on paper meant nothing when a submarine was sliding underneath your convoy at 180 feet, and your depth charges were exploding at 165 feet because the pressure seal leaked just enough to delay the firing pin by 2.3 seconds. Rawlins had seen this exact failure mode before. Not with depth charges, but with hydraulic presses at the Ford plant. A thin gasket would hold pressure for a few seconds, then bleed just enough that the system lagged. On a press, that meant a bad panel stamping. On a depth charge dropped at 20 knots over a moving submarine, that meant the bomb exploded 15 meters behind the target. Close enough to scare the crew, but not close enough to crack the hull. He stood there on the pitching deck with wind cutting through his galley whites and salt spray stinging his face, holding a faulty copper gasket worth maybe 75 cents if you bought it retail, knowing that this one piece of cost-saving stupidity was the reason U-boats were slipping through the convoy screen like ghosts. The Benson had dropped 46 depth charges in the past 3 weeks. 0 confirmed kills. Sonar operators kept reporting solid contacts. The captain kept ordering attack runs, and every time the charges detonated in perfect sequence with no result except oil slicks that turned out to be from ruptured fuel tanks on the destroyers themselves. A voice behind him cut through the wind. "Rawlins, what the hell are you doing topside? Galley doesn't run itself." Rawlins turned. Chief Petty Officer Hackett stood in the hatchway, a man built like a barrel, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a cliff. Hackett ran the deck crew with the kind of efficiency that came from 20 years of service and 0 tolerance for sailors wandering where they didn't belong. "Chief, we got a problem with the charges," Rawlins said, holding up the gasket. Hackett walked over, boots clanging on steel deck. "That's a gasket. They all look like that." "Not supposed to be this thin," Rawlins said. "Should be 0.8 millimeters. This is 0.5. Pressure seal leaks, firing pin delays. Charge goes off too late. Hackett stared at him. You a depth charge technician now, Cook? I'm a mechanic who got stuck cracking eggs, Rawlins replied. But I know what a bad seal looks like. This is why we're not killing submarines. For a long 5 seconds, the only sound was the wind and the distant hum of the Benson's engines. Then Hackett took the gasket, held it up to the light the way Rawlins had, and swore quietly. How many charges you check? Hackett asked. 6. All bad. How many total we got aboard? 60, Rawlins said. All of them probably the same batch. Hackett looked at the depth charge racks, then at the convoy spread out ahead, then back at Rawlins. Captain's not going to believe this unless you can prove it. I can prove it, Rawlins said. Give me a working charge. Let me replace one gasket. Drop it next time we get a contact. You'll see the difference. With what gasket? Hackett asked. We don't carry spares. Rawlins thought for exactly 2 seconds. Galley's got a copper panel behind the stove. Fire suppression backing. Same grade copper. I can cut new gaskets. Hackett's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. You're telling me you want to rip apart the galley to fix ordnance that's built in a factory and approved by engineers who get paid 10 times what you make? I'm telling you, Rawlins said, that if we don't fix this, the next U-boat that shows up is going to put 2 torpedoes into a tanker, and 200 men are going to burn to death while we drop charges that explode in the wrong place. The destroyer rolled hard to port. Both men grabbed the depth charge rack to steady themselves. Somewhere forward, the Benson's forward gun fired a single star shell that lit the sky for 3 seconds. A white magnesium flare that showed the convoy spread out like toys in a bathtub. Then darkness returned, and with it the knowledge that anything could be down there, lining up a shot, waiting. Hackett made his decision the way chiefs always did, fast, brutal, and without asking permission. You got 2 hours. Make it work. If the captain asks, I authorized emergency galley repairs, and you got confused about which panel to pull. Rawlins was already moving. He went back down the ladder, through the passageways, into the galley where the coffee had boiled down to sludge. Behind the stove was a copper panel exactly as he'd remembered, 18 inches square, 0.9 millimeters thick, installed by some shipyard worker in 1924, who never imagined it would end up as an improvised munitions fix in the middle of the North Atlantic. He pulled the panel off with a screwdriver and a pry bar. The copper was oxidized green in places, but structurally sound. He laid it on the galley prep table and used a mess tin lid as a template, tracing 60 small circles with a grease pencil. Then he pulled out his rigging knife, a cheap folding blade he'd bought in a Portsmouth pawn shop, and started cutting. Cutting gaskets from sheet copper with a dull knife on a rolling ship was not a process anyone had written a manual for. Rawlins worked with the methodical patience of a man who understood that rushing meant ruining the piece and starting over. Each gasket had to be 0.8 millimeters thick, with a clean inner diameter that matched the pressure chamber. Too loose, and it wouldn't seal. Too tight, and it wouldn't sit flush. He cut the first one in 8 minutes, the second one in 6. By the 10th, he had the rhythm down and was cutting one every 4 minutes. The galley hatch opened. Seaman Kowalski stuck his head in. Chief says sonar's got a contact. Captain's ordering attack run in 20 minutes. Rawlins looked at the copper sheet. He had 12 gaskets cut, 48 to go. 20 minutes wasn't enough time, not even close. But 12 gaskets meant 12 charges, and 12 charges meant 1 full pattern if the captain ordered a shallow drop. Tell Chief I got 12 ready, Rawlins said. "I'll bring them up in 10. Kowalski disappeared. Rawlins kept cutting. His hands were cramping. The knife blade was dulling. He worked through it the way he'd worked through every brutal midnight shift at Ford, where falling behind meant the line stopped, and stopping the line meant someone got fired. At 04:47, he finished the 12th gasket. He grabbed them all in both hands and ran for the stern, slipping twice on wet decking, nearly dropping the entire batch into a puddle of seawater and oil. Hackett met him at the depth charge racks, with 2 crew members already pulling charges out and laying them on the deck. 12 only, Rawlins said, handing them over. I need another hour for the rest. You got 30 minutes, Hackett said. Sonar contact is solid. U-boat running at 150 feet, heading 270, speed 8 knots. Captain wants a full diamond pattern, but I'm telling him we're loading a test spread first. Rawlins and the crew installed the new gaskets in 12 charges. The work was fast and filthy. Hands covered in grease, fingers burned on metal still hot from storage below. Each charge got its new gasket, each Mark 17 pistol got screwed back on, and each drum went back into the rack with the kind of care usually reserved for live explosives, which they were. At 05:02, the Benson's engines roared to full power. The destroyer heeled hard to starboard, cutting across the convoy's wake toward the sonar contact. On the bridge, the captain was listening to the sonar operator call out ranges. Contact bearing 265, range 1,200 yards, depth 150 feet, classified, U-boat, confidence high. Hackett gave Rawlins a look that meant, get off this deck or you're going over the side when these things drop. Rawlins moved to the rail and held on. The Benson accelerated to 28 knots, bow cutting white foam, stern settling low as the screws bit hard. At 800 yards, the captain gave the order. Drop pattern Delta, shallow fuse, 12 charges. The K-gun launchers fired first, 2 charges from each beam, arcing out and away from the ship in shallow trajectories. Then the stern racks released. 12 depth charges tumbled off the fantail in 2 neat rows, splashing into the black water at precise intervals. Rawlins counted in his head. Drop at 28 knots over a target moving at 8 knots meant relative closure of 20 knots. Charges set for 150 feet depth. In theory, old gaskets would delay detonation by 2.3 seconds, meaning the pattern would explode 40 meters behind the submarine. In theory, new gaskets would fire on time, and the submarine would be in the center of the kill zone when 3,600 pounds of Torpex detonated within 50 meters of its pressure hull. The first charge exploded at 05:03:14. A white column of water shot 200 feet into the air, lit orange by the explosion beneath. The second charge followed 1 second later, then the third. The pattern walked across the ocean in a perfect diamond, each blast punching upward with a sound like thunder breaking underwater. And then, in the center of the pattern, something else came up. Not water, oil. Black, thick, spreading fast. Then debris, wooden planking, cork insulation, pieces of equipment too mangled to identify. And finally, bodies. The Benson circled the debris field. The sonar operator confirmed the target was gone. Contact lost. No engine noise. Wreckage on surface. On the fantail, Chief Hackett stood with his arms crossed, watching the oil slick spread. He looked at Rawlins, who was still standing at the rail with galley whites soaked through and hands shaking from adrenaline. That's U-615, Hackett said quietly. Killed 40 men in 3 minutes. Never even knew we were there. Rawlins nodded. He felt nothing. No pride, no horror. Just the certainty that the math had worked. The gasket had sealed, and the charge had detonated exactly where it was supposed to. Hackett turned to his crew. "Strip every charge on this ship. Replace every gasket. Rawlins, you got 4 hours and whatever tools you need. After that, we're back on patrol, and the next U-boat that shows up better pray they're faster than we are." At 05:17, as the Benson returned to the convoy and the sky began to lighten with false dawn, Joseph Rawlins went back to his galley and started cutting gaskets 49 through 60. The copper panel behind the stove was gone. In its place was a gap that showed bare steel and exposed rivets. Fire suppression regulations said that panel was mandatory. Reality said the only fire that mattered right now was the one under the boilers driving this ship toward the next fight. He worked through breakfast call. Men came to the galley hatch asking for coffee and eggs. He told them to wait. The ones who complained got a look from Chief Hackett that made them reconsider. By 08:45, Rawlins had 60 gaskets cut, inspected, and ready. By 09:30, every depth charge on the Benson had been refitted. At 10:15, the sonar operator picked up 2 new contacts. Multiple U-boats running in a wolf pack formation, closing on the convoy from the northwest. The captain ordered the Benson and 2 other escorts to intercept. This time, when the charges dropped, they would all have the right gaskets. This time, the submarines would learn that the North Atlantic had just become a very different kind of ocean. Rawlins stood on the deck and watched the horizon, knowing that somewhere out there, 5 more U-boat captains were lining up shots, confident their targets would miss. He had 90 minutes to prove them wrong. At 10:17 in the morning of February 9th, 1943, the USS Benson's sonar operator called out 5 distinct contacts, moving in coordinated formation 3,200 yards northwest of convoy HX-224. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, the ship's executive officer, stood behind the sonar station, watching the amber traces on the oscilloscope paint patterns that meant only one thing: wolf pack. German U-boats didn't hunt alone anymore. They traveled in groups of 4 to 8 submarines, spread across 10 miles of ocean, communicating by radio, coordinating attacks like predators isolating wounded prey from a herd. The Benson's captain, Commander Frank Whitmore, was a career officer who'd spent 1941 escorting convoys that lost 30% of their ships, and 1942 watching that number climb to 40%. He dropped more depth charges than any other destroyer commander in the Atlantic Fleet, and had exactly 0 confirmed kills to show for it. His crew whispered that he was cursed, that U-boats could smell his ship coming and dove deep where the charges couldn't reach them. The truth was simpler and more brutal. His weapons hadn't worked, and men had died while he followed procedures that assured him everything was within acceptable parameters. Now he stood on the bridge, looking at 5 sonar contacts that represented roughly 250 German sailors preparing to put torpedoes into ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and 4,000 Allied troops bound for North Africa. He had 3 escorts, including his own. The convoy was spread across 12 square miles of ocean. The math was ugly. Even if every depth charge worked perfectly, they couldn't cover all 5 submarines before at least 2 of them got into firing position. Joseph Rawlins stood on the Benson's fantail, next to the depth charge racks he'd spent 4 hours rebuilding. Chief Hackett had ordered him topside not because cooks belonged on the deck during combat, but because if the modified charges failed, someone needed to explain why to the captain before he had Rawlins court-martialed for sabotaging ordnance. Rawlins wore a life vest over his galley whites and a borrowed steel helmet that sat too far back on his head. He looked like a man dressed for the wrong job, which he was, except the job he was actually doing was keeping 400 sailors alive with copper gaskets cut from a kitchen panel. The Benson came hard to port, engines driving to 29 knots, bow throwing white spray that reached the forward gun mount. Whitmore's voice came over the 1MC speaker system, flat and cold. "All hands, general quarters. We have multiple submarine contacts closing on the convoy. All escorts will engage on my command. This is not a drill." Rawlins grabbed the rail as the destroyer heeled into the turn. Around him, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. Gun crews loading 5-inch shells, damage control teams sealing hatches, lookouts scanning the horizon for periscope wakes that almost never appeared until it was too late. The ocean was gray under a sky the color of old steel. The wind had picked up to 15 knots, enough to make the smaller merchant ships in the convoy pitch and roll like toys. The first U-boat made its mistake at 10:24. It came shallow, too shallow, trying to get a visual bearing on the lead transport. The Benson's forward lookout spotted the periscope at 1,800 yards, a thin line of white wake that lasted maybe 4 seconds before it dropped. But 4 seconds was enough. Sonar locked the contact. The captain ordered attack speed. At 1,400 yards, the U-boat dove hard, pushing for 200 feet where most depth charges exploded harmlessly above or behind the target. Standard German doctrine said American charges were too slow, too poorly fused, too easy to evade if you had a captain with nerve and a boat that could handle steep angles. This U-boat captain had nerve. What he didn't have was accurate intelligence about what was sitting on the Benson's stern racks. Whitmore gave the order at 600 yards. "Drop pattern alpha, deep fuse, 24 charges, full spread." The K-guns fired first, hurling charges out to both sides of the destroyer in high arcs that peaked at 40 feet above the water before gravity took over. Then the stern racks released in sequence, 12 charges rolling off the fantail like barrels off a truck, splashing into the Benson's wake at 1-second intervals. Rawlins watched them drop and hit, each one disappearing into green-black water with a sound like a body hitting pavement from height. He counted in his head. Target depth 200 feet, charges fused for 180 feet to bracket above and force the submarine deeper into the pressure zone. Drop speed at 29 knots over target, moving at 12 knots, gave relative closure of 17 knots. Old gaskets would delay detonation by 2.3 seconds, meaning the pattern would explode 60 meters astern. New gaskets, his gaskets, would fire on time. The first charge detonated at 10:25 minutes 08, exactly where it should have. The explosion sent a column of white water 150 feet into the air, the blast so violent that sailors on the Benson's stern felt the shock wave through the deck plating. The second charge followed 1 second later, then the third, the fourth, marching across the ocean in a lethal sequence that turned physics into a hammer. 24 charges detonated in 18 seconds. Each one released the energy equivalent of 300 pounds of TNT, compressed into a pressure wave that traveled faster through water than through air. At 200 feet depth, those waves converged on a submarine hull designed to withstand external pressure of 150 pounds per square inch. The explosions generated pressure spikes exceeding 2,000 psi, within a 50-meter radius. The U-boat's hull cracked in 4 places simultaneously: forward torpedo room, control room, aft engine compartment, and along the keel beneath the conning tower. Water came in at 400 gallons per second. The boat's emergency blow system tried to force ballast out with compressed air, but the hull ruptures were too large and the inrushing water too fast. In 17 seconds, the submarine went from controlled dive to uncontrolled plunge. At 380 feet, the remaining hull sections imploded. On the surface, oil and debris boiled up in a spreading circle 200 yards wide. Wood fragments, clothing, personal effects, and pieces of equipment tumbled in the churn. Then bodies, some intact, some not, rose slowly in the oil slick that marked where 53 German sailors had just died faster than thought. Chief Hackett stood next to Rawlins and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The charges had worked. The submarine was gone. Math had been converted into corpses with an efficiency that no one on the fantail felt good about, but everyone understood was necessary. The sonar operator's voice crackled over the bridge speaker. "Contact destroyed. Second contact bearing 285. Range 2,400 yards. Depth 160 feet. Classified U-boat. Confidence high. Third contact bearing 310. Range 3,100 yards. Depth unknown." 2 more submarines. One of them already lining up a shot on the convoy's port flank, where a tanker full of aviation fuel sat low in the water with a top speed of 9 knots. If that tanker took a torpedo, it would burn for 3 days and kill everyone aboard, plus anyone on nearby ships when the fuel tanks ruptured and spread fire across the ocean. Whitmore didn't hesitate. He ordered the Benson toward the second contact at full speed and radioed the escort destroyer USS Madison to take the third. The convoy continued southeast, unaware that 2 submarines were converging on its flank, and a third was already at periscope depth, tracking the lead transport. At 10:31, the Benson reached attack position over the second U-boat. This one was deeper, 160 feet and descending, trying to get below the effective kill zone. German submarine commanders were learning. They'd heard the explosions from the first kill. They knew something had changed. Standard doctrine said dive deep and wait for the destroyer to run out of charges. What they didn't know was that every charge on the Benson now carried gaskets cut by a cook with a rigging knife, and deep didn't mean safe anymore. Whitmore ordered a deep pattern. 18 charges fused for 200 feet. The K-guns fired. The stern racks released. 18 depth charges hit the water and sank like stones toward a submarine that was pushing hard for 250 feet, engines screaming, hull groaning under pressure that made rivets weep and seams flex. The charges detonated in a sequence that compressed 15 seconds of violence into a space the size of a city block. The U-boat tried to evade by turning hard to starboard, but turning at depth meant losing speed, and losing speed meant sinking deeper into the kill zone. 3 charges exploded within 30 meters of the hull. The pressure waves hit like hammers swung by giants. The submarine's hull held for 1.2 seconds, then failed catastrophically along the pressure hull weld lines. This time, there was no slow sinking. The boat broke in half. The forward section flooded instantly, and plunged toward the bottom 1,800 feet below. The aft section, still buoyant from trapped air in the engine room, rose briefly before capsizing and sinking stern first. 48 men died in darkness and pressure, and the certain knowledge that they'd been caught by something they didn't understand and couldn't outrun. On the Benson's bridge, the sonar operator confirmed the kill. "Contact destroyed. Fourth contact bearing 290, range 1,900 yards, depth 140 feet, moving toward convoy at speed." That was the dangerous one. The U-boat that hadn't hesitated, hadn't dove deep, hadn't tried to evade. It was pressing the attack, running shallow and fast, betting it could get one torpedo salvo off before the escorts reached it. That kind of aggression meant either a rookie captain with no fear or a veteran with ice in his veins who knew exactly how long he had before the destroyers arrived. Whitmore turned the Benson hard to port and pushed the engines past their rated maximum. The destroyer shook as the screws bit water, and the turbines screamed at 32,000 shaft horsepower. They covered 1,900 yards in exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds. At 10:38, the U-boat fired. 2 torpedoes, both aimed at the tanker on the convoy's port flank. The torpedoes' wakes were visible from the Benson's bridge, 2 white lines converging on a ship that had no chance of evading and no armor to stop what was coming. Rawlins saw it happen from the fantail. The first torpedo hit the tanker amidships, just below the waterline. The explosion was muted, a dull thump that seemed too quiet for what it represented. Then the fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the water in a perfect circle 300 feet wide, orange and black, fed by thousands of gallons of aviation fuel that burned at temperatures high enough to melt steel. The second torpedo missed. It passed under the tanker's keel and continued into empty ocean, where it ran out of fuel and sank. But one torpedo was enough. The tanker was finished. Crew members jumped from the deck into burning water. Some made it to lifeboats. Most didn't. The U-boat dove immediately after firing, pushing deep, trying to escape before the Benson arrived. But the destroyer was already there, charges ready, crew locked in, captain past the point where hesitation mattered. Whitmore dropped 12 charges directly over the submarine's last known position. The U-boat was at 180 feet and accelerating downward when the first charge detonated 40 feet above its hull. The pressure wave crushed the conning tower hatch seals. Water sprayed into the control room at pressure high enough to cut skin. The captain ordered emergency surface blow, but before the compressed air could clear the ballast tanks, the next 5 charges detonated in sequence. The submarine's hull buckled amidships. The control room flooded in 4 seconds. The captain and 12 crew members drowned at their stations. The remaining 34 sailors in the forward and aft compartments had maybe 20 seconds before the ocean came for them through ruptures they couldn't see and couldn't seal. The boat surfaced briefly, not by design, but because trapped air forced the bow up at a steep angle. For 5 seconds, the U-boat's forward hull broke the surface like a dying whale. Then water rushed into the open hatches and dragged it back down. It sank in water too deep for recovery. 46 men gone. 3 submarines destroyed in 21 minutes. The 4th and 5th contacts turned away and dove deep, abandoning the attack. They'd heard the explosions. They'd monitored the radio silence from 3 boats that should have been reporting their attacks. German U-boat doctrine said, When the escort screen became lethal, withdraw and find easier prey. By 11 o'clock, the convoy was clear. The tanker that had been torpedoed was still burning, flames visible for 15 miles, but the remaining 52 merchant ships continued southeast under escort that now understood its weapons actually worked. Joseph Rawlins stood on the Benson's fantail and watched the smoke from the burning tanker fade into the horizon. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion and the surreal understanding that he'd just participated in killing roughly 150 men using explosives he'd personally modified with kitchen copper and a dull knife. Chief Hackett walked over and handed him a cup of coffee that tasted like oil and rust. "Captain wants to see you," Hackett said. "Bring one of your gaskets." Rawlins climbed to the bridge where Commander Whitmore stood looking at the convoy spread out ahead like a formation that had suddenly remembered how to survive. The captain was 42 years old, with grey hair and the permanent expression of a man who'd watched too many ships sink. "Ship's cook second-class Rawlins, sir," Rawlins said, standing at attention with grease still under his fingernails and copper shavings stuck to his galley whites. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. "Let me see one of those gaskets." Rawlins handed over a spare he'd kept in his pocket. Whitmore examined it. A crude circle of copper, edges rough from knife cuts, thickness uneven in places where the blade had wandered. It looked like something a child made in shop class. It looked nothing like a precision-manufactured component that belonged in a weapon system designed by engineers with advanced degrees. "This is what you used," Whitmore said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Cut from the galley fire panel. 0.8 millimeters thick instead of 0.5. Seals the pressure chamber properly. Firing pin hits on time. Charges detonate at preset depth instead of 15 meters late." Whitmore turned the gasket over in his hand. "You realize," he said quietly, "that by modifying ordnance without authorization, you violated about 40 regulations and could face court-martial." "Yes, sir." "You also realize that these modifications just saved every ship in this convoy and killed 3 submarines but would have put 10 torpedoes into fuel tankers and troop transports." "Yes, sir." Whitmore handed the gasket back. "How many gaskets can you produce per day if I give you proper tools and materials?" Rawlins thought about it. "With a proper punch and die, maybe 200 per day? With a crew helping, 500. "Then you're not a cook anymore," Whitmore said. "Effective immediately, you're assigned to Ordnance Modification Detail. You'll work with Chief Hackett to refit every depth charge in the Atlantic Fleet with your gaskets. I'm sending a priority message to Fleet Command, recommending immediate adoption across all escort vessels. I'm also recommending you for promotion to Petty Officer First Class and citation for distinguished service." Rawlins stood there on the bridge of a destroyer that smelled like cordite and seawater, holding a rough copper washer worth 75 cents, while the captain who'd just killed 3 submarines with his modifications told him he'd never crack another egg for the Navy. "Sir," Rawlins said carefully, "the procurement officer who approved the thin gaskets to save 12 cents per unit, what happens to him?" Whitmore's expression didn't change. "That's above my pay grade, Petty Officer. But I'm going to make damn sure my report mentions that cost-saving measures killed American sailors for 8 months, while submarines walked through our screen like we weren't there. Someone in Washington gets to explain why they value 12 cents over 200 lives." The message went out at 1400 that afternoon. By February 12th, every escort destroyer in the North Atlantic had received modified depth charges with Rawlins gaskets. By February 20th, the modification had been adopted fleet-wide. By March, U-boat kill rates tripled. By April, German Submarine Command withdrew wolf packs from the convoy routes because the casualties were unsustainable. Joseph Rawlins spent the rest of the war cutting gaskets, training ordnance crews, and watching sonar contacts turn into oil slicks. He never went back to the galley. The Navy kept him in ordnance modification until VE Day, then transferred him to the Pacific, where his gaskets adapted to Japanese depth charges and helped clear submarine screens around Okinawa. After the war, he returned to Detroit and went back to work at Ford, where he spent 30 years fixing engines and never told anyone he'd killed 147 German submariners with a kitchen panel and a rigging knife. The official Navy report credits improved depth charge fusing for the dramatic increase in U-boat kills in early 1943. Joseph Rawlins' name appears in exactly 3 documents: a promotion order, a service citation, and a technical bulletin describing gasket specifications. Commander Whitmore survived the war and retired as a rear admiral. He kept one of Rawlins' original gaskets on his desk until 1968. When he died, it was buried with him. The USS Benson continued escort duty until 1945, sinking 7 more submarines before the war ended. The galley never got its fire suppression panel replaced. Fire inspectors noted the violation in 1944. The captain told them to file a complaint after they'd personally cut 500 copper gaskets that saved 4,000 lives. Convoy HX-224 reached Liverpool on February 17, 1943, with 51 of its original 53 ships. The 2 losses, 1 tanker torpedoed, 1 freighter lost to weather, represented the lowest casualty rate for any convoy that month. The procurement officer who'd approved the thin gaskets to save 12 cents per unit was reassigned to a desk job in Kansas. His name was redacted from all official reports. 75-cent copper washers, cut by a cook who should have been making eggs, became standard equipment on every Allied escort vessel for the remainder of the war. Total submarines sunk with Rawlins modified charges, 83. Total lives saved by those kills, estimated 12,000 merchant sailors and convoy personnel, who would have died if the submarines had continued operating with impunity. The math was simple. 1 man with a knife, 1 fire panel, 4 hours of work, and the willingness to break every regulation that stood between good enough and actually working. The Atlantic convoys continued. The submarines kept trying. The depth charges detonated exactly where they were supposed to. And somewhere in Detroit, decades later, a retired Ford mechanic kept a single, rough-cut copper gasket in his toolbox and never explained why.